Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So my next interview is with Blitz the Ambassador, and you're going to find out why Blitz goes by that name. But you're going to want to, whatever you do, even if you check out of this interview early, but I bet you won't. This is one of the most engaging interviews I've done in a long time, and you're going to love what Blitz has to say pretty much about everything. And this is a film that you're going to definitely want to see, even if you come back to the interview later. And by the way, forward it on to others too. But The Burial of Kojo is a film that will be available on Netflix in the very near future, and check it out. It's gorgeous. It's stunning cinematography, and it is a film, once again, a great film, right? It's about so many things. It's not about any one thing, but it's about a family, and it's about what Blitz would call a truthful moment. And we talk a lot about that. Film versus literature, and Blitz is very committed to telling an African story in a very African way. You're going to want to check this film out. It's about genetic memory, and we get into paradox and guilt. And what about your grandmother, and what kind of an impact did she have on you and how you tell stories? And, I say to Blitz at one point that if he's thinking about doing a course in filmmaking and storytelling, I'm going to be one of his first students. You're going to love this film. It's, we get into international development. We talk about magic and realism. And again, The Burial of Kojo, it's a beautiful film. It's coming out on Netflix in the very near future. Check it out. And don't forget davidpecklive.com for more information about my speaking and my writing. And if you want to get behind Face to Face and support us financially, you can do that through patreon.com. Search for us there. If you can't do that, totally get it. Would love for you to leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, something along those lines. Your digital commentary would be welcome. And if you want to advertise on Face to Face, reach out to us. You can do that here too. We've got a great following. We have a committed following. We have over 1 million listens. We are on Twitter and have a great presence there as well. So we can help you do what you do better in a very specific way. And rabble.ca for more podcasts, more blogs, more news for the rest of us. Check it out. There's a whole lot there going on, way more going on than meets the eye. Coming right up, Blitz the Ambassador, talking about a whole lot of things in his beautiful and stunning new film, The Burial of Kojo. Well, welcome to Face. We're joined by a very special guest here today. I'm with Blitz the Ambassador here, who is calling in on Skype from Egypt at the Luxor Film Festival. Blitz, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we're here to talk about your new film, The Burial of Kojo, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about a whole host of other things as well. But before we go any further, can you tell me a little bit about your name, Blitz the Ambassador? What's going on there, Blitz?
So I mean, the Blitz part was came about from my early beginnings as an MC, as a rapper. And the style in which, I rapped in was fast. It was that double time rap style. And I always used to get that, it sounds like you're blitzing the track,
Right.
and that just kind of, that stuck. And I went by Blitz for a while. And then over time, as my personal understanding of, my role as an artist kind of evolved, the ambassador part became necessary in understanding that I am, as I originally come from Ghana, and having an opportunity to give people around the world a sense of what it means to be a young African moving around the world, and also a young Ghanaian. Kind of it became, that's kind of where the ambassador part came from. And it's been my MC name for probably over a decade now.
So you're from Ghana originally. You also have a New York City address, I believe. So you are. And would you call yourself an eclectic artist? Is that a fair? Um, I don't really like putting labels on people, but you seem to work in a lot of different genres.
Yeah, for me, it began as a visual artist. I
Right.
always start there because, that visual art is kind of has been my core medium,
Mm,
and everything I've done has had a strong visual narrative. Even when I made music, it was very visual in the way that I put music together and in my music videos and the sonic elements themselves.
mm.
Moving from that and then into the music space and then into the film space, it's all been for me one journey. I don't separate the medium at all. I've always looked at all medium as a path,
Right.
and I think
A continuum of sorts.
exactly it is
Yeah.
a continuum, and it just depends on what muscle you are using at that time, and but they all come from the same source, and in fact they all inform each other pretty frequently. um, I
Absolutely.
I can't make music without thinking visually. I can't make a film without thinking rhythmically, and those things kind of end up have been a huge advantage for me in terms of developing all these mediums.
I love how you say they're all connected in their own way. They all come from the same source. There's something very beautiful about that, and I think that's clearly a theme in the film, "The Burial of Kojo 2," for sure. By the way, just before I ask you a little bit about the music, congratulations on the film. It's a beautiful, thoughtful, and engaging piece. It's gorgeous to look at, and congrats to your cinematographer. Was that Michael Fernandez, right? I mean, just you
Yes.
guys clearly make a killer team.
Thank you very much. And yes, Michael and I, it's funny, we're both musicians, specifically hip hop artists. And so it's very interesting. I met him on the hip hop circuit, and we always talked about doing something visual. And it so happened that the Burial of Kojo presented itself. But we were very concerned outside of just making a film, we were very concerned about what African cinematic language is and should be, and how it relates to how we know storytelling. Fortunately, he's also from a similar background, although he's of Mexican descent. He comes from a similar storytelling lineage, and so the way he understood the Burial of Kojo as a story was very similar to mine. And so that was a lot of what we were discussing, and it wasn't. And I do appreciate the compliment of the images of the film and how beautifully they were laid out. But for me and Mike, our core conversation was about truthful moments. That's all we
Mm.
kept reminding ourselves is, it doesn't matter how good it looks if it's not truthful. And that was always our beginning and that was always our end. And it so happened that we were very fortunate. We shot in a beautiful place. We had a beautiful narrative that was tender and thoughtful. But overall, it was about capturing beautiful, truthful moments.
So let's come back to that in a second. I really love that phrase, "truthful moments." I think that's is that going to be a book that maybe you're going to write one day? Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah. You got the title of your autobiography there, Blitz.
There
Um,
you go.
I love that in film. I love that in music. I love the idea of creating a truthful moment in a conversation. I think that's what I've tried to do with, this podcast with Face to Face, and that is have real, true, authentic conversations with people about their films, about their stories, about their books, and try to, I don't know, connect the dots, I guess. And hopefully others will listen in and they'll resonate in some way, shape, or form. Hey, you said just a few minutes ago that when you made music, does that mean you're no longer making music, or are you now sort of a filmmaker going forward? That's the future for you, or again, is this just all part of the continuum?
No, and I mean it mainly from making music exclusively, because there was a time in which I was fully focused on just music, and that was great. But I think that I can never stop being a musician. I mean, even making the Barrel of Kojo, the score was very integral to making the film, and composing the score was just as important. And so, music as a medium, I don't think I'll ever let that go. But there was a time that that was primarily my medium, and it no longer is.
So you talk about truthful moments. Let's get back to that. I love that. I think if I was going to call our talk today, our conversation today, that's what I'd label it. I'd say this is a truthful moment here, or a series of them connected together. Let's look at a couple scenes in the film. I mean, it really is stunning, and the colors are, as I said, they're just lush and really vivid and stark and in your face, and part of the storytelling as well. But you called yourself a visual artist first and foremost. Did you and Mike talk about that and say, this is a character in the story, this is a way to tell this story in a particular way? I think of the opening, the establishing shot with the Volkswagen and the baby blue and the water. I think of the two brothers fighting with the red, gorgeous red background, and there's others too that come to mind. But yeah, just wondering a little bit about some of those choices.
So visually, we were very well. We knew that this story would have to be told through a series of very stark visual images, those that will arrest the audience. Also, the thing that was important for us was knowing kind of how African films have been, I shouldn't say all, because that wouldn't be fair, but I think most African films have been kind of made from a bit of a voyeuristic perspective,
Right.
where it appears the DP is almost trying not to get as close to characters as possible, and or when it's color corrected, it's extremely desaturated and almost sepia tone looking, and that became kind of the palette of African filmmaking for a while. And if you look at a lot of successful African or films that claim to be African, from Hotel Rwanda all the way on down, they have an earth tony approach to how it's made. And one thing Mike and I were very critical about was to veer away from that. Our first question is, what does it feel like to be really on the continent? And that's the real beginning. And and when Mike landed, one of the first things I did was I took him to the market. And we have a grand market in Ghana called the Makola market. Makola is the centerpiece. If you can survive going through Makola and being enjoying and being in communion with the people there, then you'll have absolutely no problem photographing them. It is a densely populated market. It is active. It comes at you, and Michael loved every minute of being in the market. And that's when I knew I'd found my DP, because being African and knowing the relationship the continent of Africa has to cinema, it has almost always been a told from a third party perspective.
Right.
There's very, very, very few African films that are produced, directed by, written by Africans who are from the continent, who've lived there, who breathe it, know it, right? And so for us, the other question was, how do you create a specific language that relates directly to the source? And all of that begun for us with remembering how we know storytelling to be. And for me, I always say that it begins with my grandmother's stories, because her stories were just like the Burial of Kojo. They were visual, they were magical, they were allegorical, they were folk tales, they were everything. That they were vivid, even though they weren't visual. Right. And that's all we were attempting to do with the Burial of Kojo is kind of think about if my grandmother had a camera, what kind of film will she make?
Right. What a great lens to see your film through, or a great starting point.
and that was it, and so we knew immediately what to leave out, because I'll
Mm.
immediately know that my grandmother will completely never be interested in that kind of character. That character will never appear in her story, and so those things became the core, and I feel like every people who have self-actualized on this planet, or to a certain degree, count very, very much on that folk narrative, that narrative of themselves that goes much deeper than the modern world, right? And if you watch Japanese cinema, it's very clear how the short choices are informed by traditional Japanese culture. Same as French New Wave. Same as American cinema. Everything has a root to kind of the way story is understood, or the way narrative is understood. So for us, the Burial of Kojo was an opportunity for us to assert what African storytelling is, which means not everything will fit into our neat three-act structure. We'll have to invent and reinvent, and be as fluid with the camera, and be as experimental with our framing, and flip frames when we need to, because sometimes the world is upside down in the worlds of my grandmother's
Mm.
stories, right? And it reflected how characters felt. And so that level of freedom, I think, was super critical to arrive at a film like The Barrel of Kojo.
So good. Tell me, wonderful. Tell me more about the African versus the third party perspective. When you say third party, are you essentially meaning sort of white Western European kind of approach? I mean, that's a pretty big paintbrush, I suppose. But is that sort of because I've read a couple of reviews of the film, and people have few critics have talked about this African diversity in film, and how it was kind of lost, and how people like yourself are helping us, helping you to sort of reclaim that ground. Is that a fair way to say it, Blitz?
No, that's about right, and you don't have to kind of look too far to see the truth in that. I mean, first of all, filmmaking is such an expensive medium,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that expense, just has created a barrier to entry that was unsurmountable for most African filmmakers. So then most films were then funded by either grant money from Europe, or
Right.
Hollywood blockbusters, would use Africa as a backdrop for their narratives, right? So most of what we know about Africa in cinema has not been an autonomous voice. That's just the reality of it. And like I said, the financial barrier is probably one of the biggest. But also there's a cultural barrier that we also have to discuss, because cinema, unlike other medium, right? And I'm a filmmaker, I'm a writer, I'm a musician, I'm a visual artist, and so I've had the privilege of experimenting through multiple medium, and I know that cinema, unlike music, unlike literature, and unlike fine art, has an opportunity that is quite unique in terms of medium. So it is one of the closest you get to walking in a character's shoes. Now literature has similar attributes, except you have to be literate, to engage in that medium. And we know that literacy isn't equally distributed around the world, right? So we know that barriers to entry, though, they are great. However, we can all project a film, irrespective of language, irrespective of not even having sound. We can completely understand what a character is going through based on that visual style of narrative, right? And so it is a very humanizing medium. It's the kind of medium that, if allowed to be democratic, multiple views of a people start to emerge, right? Multiple niches of character start to emerge. And I feel like so much of the world, and it's been, and we talk about a context that's much larger than cinema. Most of the world has been very adverse to an African voice, irrespective of medium and media. And we can have long debates about the why, but whatever the whys are, that's been the situation. And so the level of policing of African storytelling has been insane. And I think that the amount of a lot of it has to do with, God forbid, Africans are humanized. Then it's much harder to exploit. Then you have to sympathize. And I always say this. I mean, listen, before I went to America, or before I went to France, I only experienced these places through cinema, really, and characters, multiple characters, humanized these places, and gave level and complexity to the people. So then you grow an empathy for the people, right? So if anything happens in France, I may not have never been there, but just based on what I'd seen in image and how I'd locked into story by, say, watching a film like Amelie, right? There's an immediate empathy that grows within you, right? And that's what cinema has the power to do. So then it's no wonder when something happens on the continent of Africa, there's so little sympathy globally, because the necessity of humanizing and the need for that to happen hasn't quite hit us yet. And so that's kind of how I've seen our entire trajectory. And I've found it quite interesting that a film like The Burial of Kojo is, for the first time, bringing a completely multi-layered experience of what it means to be, African, growing up in the 21st century, whether it's through the magical realist lens or whether it's through the political, cultural lens, little things like having a telenovela playing concurrently, those things all form a humanizing experience. And hopefully the world starts to realize how much they've missed in terms of cinema and in terms of experiencing the people by watching The Burial of Kojo.
Yeah, it's so good, man. I mean, I love your line about policing the African story, and heaven forbid that we actually humanize these men and women and children. And believe me, you do, and you do it beautifully. And I felt like I was a part of this family's story, a part of their lives in a very particular way. And I think that's a real challenge for a filmmaker, to draw people in, to draw a viewer in that way. So what I love to hear, Blitz, about our conversation, we barely talked about the film, and I think we're still going strong, and I think people are definitely going to be interested in seeing it, just based on the level of dialogue and some of the subjects that we're touching on. Hey, like any great film, your film is about a whole lot of things. It's certainly about a story, and there's the surface, and then there's the metaphor, and we've got the water and the crows, and we've got the visuals and the cinematography. We've got the performances, which are stellar, by the way. Everybody's performances is so great in the film. I'm pretty sure it's Kojo who says water can cleanse the past, and we hear this pretty early on in the film. Can you talk a little bit about that symbol, that metaphor that seems to be very much almost a character in the film, but yet maybe didn't apply in Kojo's particular case, if that makes any sense at all?
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, and
Without giving away too much.
of course, of course. Now the story, was, obviously it's about two brothers, with a jagged past, and that was kind of where it began, for me. It was like, and then guilt became the centerpiece of the film. And Mike and I's conversation was always, how do we characterize guilt? Like, what does guilt feel like? Guilt is like a wave. It doesn't. It's constantly there. It has its ebbs, its flows. And if you don't do anything about it, it drowns you. Right. And in a way, the same thing that can cleanse you can drown you. That was kind of our consistent metaphor through the film. And whether it was the micro narrative about his brother almost drowning him, whether it was about, all these little things was just consistent with water, because that's how we felt guilt should be represented throughout the film. And it also, again, goes back to this metaphor and the richness of African storytelling, in my opinion, is unmatched. Obviously, it's probably one of the oldest in in human history. And so you can imagine the layering that I don't even think a cinematic world has the ability to bring forth some of the layers that have been in African folklore for centuries. But for us, that was our great attempt. Our great attempt was, how do we use metaphor? How do we use symbolism to represent the afterlife, to represent the present life? Everything had to have dual and sometimes three layers of one thing. And if you notice, the film really is told in three parallels, right? It's told from the daughter who's much older now, who's written about the story and is kind of narrating it. It's told from the story that we know it to be. It's told from the telenovela that's playing concurrently of those two brothers, and that's kind of how a lot of the stories I remember as a kid were. Right. And first of all, they were marathon stories. They were very, they were nocturnal. Right. So we had to sit outside and some of them were scary because at the time, I think the neighborhood we lived in had a lot of power outage. And so you have to sit. It was the only entertainment you had was your grandmother's stories. And that magic we just wanted to capture a little bit of that. But of course, the water was something that was always in my grandmother's stories, and it's multi-purpose, and the fact that it cleansed, and the fact that it's turbulent, and the fact that it can drown, and the fact that it's necessary for life. All these things were critical. And so, in making this first film for me, it was like, how do you process all this stuff that's, some of it I even term genetic memory. It's not even perhaps what I remember as a child, because though I was leaning very hard on my personal memories in making this film. Like a lot of the perspective of the little girl is my vantage point when I was a kid, like listening to adults talk, like when she shows up at the police station and it's just her vantage point with her mother, trying to get a sense of where things are. That was how I remember myself as a child, just never really being able to put the story together. Like it's all this adult chatter, and you're trying to kind of make sense. You get sent to buy something, you come back, the story has moved further, you're trying to figure out where you remember it from. Right. And so that was a lot of the perspective that we were working from. But then there's also the other side, which I term genetic memory, and was something that Mike and I spoke about a lot, which was, how about the things that we don't even remember, but it's deep inside of us, right?
Well, you know what, Bliss. Sorry to interrupt you, but I couldn't help. But as you've been talking, I've been thinking about the trauma related angle to not only to Kojo's story but his experience, the funeral and the wedding on the same day, and as you're talking about this genetic memory, what are all those things that you're not even thinking about, never mind actually addressing head on, that are having an impact on who you are and how you live and how you parent and how you love and all these things.
And that's the amazing thing, as a creative, right? You have the power to kind of summon all these very little things and little parts of you that perhaps may not have the same same relevance in terms of in the physical realm. But they're still at play, and Kojo is a great example of what happens when your guilt kind of is just kind of takes a hold of you. But even much deeper, but much before him comes a whole set of things that kind of are he has to wrestle through, and so we dealt with a lot of that in the film. But making the film was also our personal journey, right, into our own understandings of what we deem to be the afterlife, what we deem to be a creative way in how to demonstrate that. We also had to count deeply on what do we remember, and what do the things inside of us remember, in order to, like, how do we know that light? How do we know where to put the camera? Let's start there.
Right.
Like those things aren't learned. They're not analytical. They're all emotional. Right. And those emotional choices often come from your subconscious. And that was something that was at play very, very much in making the film.
Just to, I love the existential paradox of the water too, how it can give life and how it can take it away. And I mean, isn't that kind of what the burial of Kojo is kind of all about? Is this existential world we live in, this life we live, we're all becoming something else. We're trying to stay present with our families, with our wives, with our husbands, with our partners, and our children, and so on, in the work what we do, and yet we're affected by our past in one way or another, and how it's all connected. I mean, I kind of almost, maybe the theme for our conversation today too is this idea of connection and continuity and continuum and commiseration. Maybe isn't that what you and I are kind of doing now through conversation? But that's kind of what you laid out in the burial of Kojo as well. This is a complicated thing. This life, and it's complicated for all of us. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the film is it's a real humanizer on so many levels, because I relate to the pain. I think I relate to the trauma. I relate to the can I almost say the PTSD almost that Kojo is kind of experiencing.
Indeed, indeed, and that was the whole idea of what happens when that trauma isn't dealt with properly,
Right,
right? Because
right,
because obviously his daughter is a victim in this as well, right? And but it's obvious when we get to the end and we finally find out, what's happening. We realize that she's had a much better, much healthier way of processing that
right.
pain,
You
right?
know
Of,
what?
of
What a
yes.
beautiful voice she has too. I mean, the narration is just so lovely and so compelling.
Thank you, and we were lucky to have a veteran Ghanaian actress, Amaki Ababrese, voice those parts, and for us, it was important that we showed we showed a again back to the word continuum, right? So I didn't want the story to end in that time, right? I wanted
Right,
people to see what happens when that pain, because again, we're dealing with a film that's it could all be imagined for all we know, right? It could be as simple as the little girl discovering her father dead,
right,
and all of it being, the crow and the uncle and everything becoming her way of coping with that entire trauma, right? It's very interesting because again, I think back as a kid, and I think back of all the things that the things that I went through as a kid, and how you know sometimes I remember it much differently than it was. And I think we all
mm,
have these experiences,
right.
and
Yes,
it's when people tell you what it is, and you almost can't believe that it was that simple, right? But because of our nature as human beings, I mean, we have this ability and this cognitive ability to create worlds that are beyond us in ways of understanding the worlds that are in front of us. And so the Burial of Kojo is dealing with a lot of that inner turmoil, but also a lot of the imagined turmoil, right? That would also kind of try to give an understanding to the clear and present turmoil.
I have to. Sadly, we're coming to the end of the time we have together today. And you know what? I actually really hope, and I often say this, Blitz, but I hope we can do a part two. I've so enjoyed our conversation today. And again, folks, you got to get out and see this film. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, where people can see it in the very near future. I loved the line, by the way. I always try to pick out a few favorite lines in the film, and I can't remember exactly who said it, but and maybe we can talk a little bit about international development and other countries' involvement in Africa. But the line was, "These white people aren't smart at all." I just thought you just had to get that in there, eh, Blitz?
No, it's hilarious because it's almost a colloquialism, right?
Right,
Because of how much scams are
mm,
run on unknowing and sometimes almost too smart for their own good foreigners, right? Who come and assume that they're dealing with a group of uneducated
right,
or
Right.
and actually think they have that upper hand. And the funny thing is that story that is narrated before that line actually happened.
I believe
These
it.
guys came, bought a bunch of gold that was just gold rocks painted as gold, and thought they had scammed the locals, yet the locals had scammed them, and it's very interesting. But overall, I think some of that is all, it's all about being true. And we were talking about truthful moments, right? That for me was important, and it wasn't just the commentary about Europeans and Americans on the continent. It's the commentary about the Chinese on the continent. It's and almost our countries are no longer sovereign, just in terms of, probably never were sovereign in terms of resource pillage, which
Right.
has kind of gone on from post-colonization to where we are now. And some of this film was also critical of that. But I made up my mind a long time ago that you have to know what fits in the foreground and what fits in the background, right?
Nice.
And any serious people, again, know to center themselves. And I wasn't concerned much. And if you notice, even as it relates to the Chinese, they were more spoken about than seen in the film.
That's right.
They
Yeah.
were more. It was more of a narration about them, right? Because I never wanted to center the film around a problem that wasn't within the family that we cared about, but I also would be remiss if I made a film as layered as The Burial of Kojo and didn't tackle some of our international relationships that also show kind of what weak institutions do to the continent. But that was commentary. At no point in the film did I give that more weight than it deserved, because I think at the end of the day, people watch the film because they want to know what this family is going through. They want to know if the little girl will survive and if she will succeed. And those are the things that I was very concerned about. And I hope we achieved in centering the family.
Well, you had me right from the get-go. I mean, I think it was partially the stark image, the opening, the water, the car, etc., the narration. I was in, and I'm trusting and hoping yet that all your audiences are going to be feeling the same way. Hey, just before I ask you a question about the layers and the intentionality behind that, I also loved the fact that the bride price for Kojo's wife included a sewing machine and a bottle of whiskey.
We had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun with listing those things.
I bet you did.
We did. The interesting thing is, of course, that sewing machine ends up being
Yeah.
kind of a something that and it's so difficult to talk about the film without giving it away.
It so is, but I hope we planted enough seeds, dropped enough pebbles in the
Absolutely.
pond here for people to say, you know what, I
Absolutely.
got to see this film. Hey, tell me
Absolutely.
about, just as we wrap up here, tell me about your intentionality as an artist, the continuum again, truthful moments. I mean, how much of that, obviously there's a script, but there's decisions you make from the directorial chair. There's DOP like decisions that are made in the moment. How much of that layering, this is a film about poverty, it's about trauma, it's about mental health, it's about PTSD and about family and love and brothers. I mean, the list goes on. I just so love that, Blitz, that we could pick any one of those things and talk about it for 35, 40 minutes. Can you kind of tell me a little bit about that intentionality and that collaborative like edge, and also maybe wrap into that? I mean, this is a film made in Ghana, funded through your channels, and a black crew as well, I believe. Isn't that right?
Yes. It was 99% local.
Wow.
The only foreigner was Michael Fernandez. Yes, who's Mexican American. But it was, and I talked about this a bit, in terms of autonomy.
Yes.
Right. It's very important, especially in the beginning of trying to form language and trying to form that you're around people who affirm you, right? But also more importantly, you're around people who don't detract just based on what they think is right, right? And I think sometimes it's you can find allies, who out of, I don't know, maybe the word is fear, feel like you should be a little bit more standard in what you're doing. One thing that we were very sure about was that this film was going to break as many rules as possible, right? And that was the beginning of our conversation. And I immediately knew that if I went through the traditional path of funding this film, that there'd be no way I'll have that autonomy, because it would be even if it's an independent studio, right? They would descend on this film and cut it into pieces in terms of the intention, right? So for me, that was the first thing, was how do you find the money yourself? And of course, we had a very successful Kickstarter campaign, which I'm super thankful for, because it gave us a significant amount of money, and the autonomy that it came with is unmatched, right? And then relates to these choices. I mean, I also say, listen, I made this film as a hip hop artist as well, which is very important, because with hip hop culture, it's sample culture, right? So I treated the script and I treated my first cut as the original sample. The rest of the film was being fed into a drum machine or MPC, and what we did was bang on these pads until we came up with something reimagined and something new and something fresh. And that for me was a lot more fun to do in terms of the spontaneity, because again, my grandmother's stories weren't based on script. They were based on spontaneity. She had characters that were thought of in the moment, that were very critical and important to where the narrative was going to go in the future. And I needed that spontaneity in making The Burial of Kojo. So yes, we begun with a script. We begun with storyboards. I think I drew all 600 frames of it.
Wow.
And it was very detailed. However, when we were done, I regarded all that as just the first step. And the first step is getting the original sample together, and now we went to work. So all that turning frames upside down, smoke going backwards, all this stuff that you see in the film is the hip hop in me saying, well, you have to think now as a producer, and you have to think now about, what elements do you chop up? What elements do you loop? What elements do you create this new rhythm with? And it was I think that I can't separate whatever the film has become from that very important step or element, which is, the idea that everything can be reimagined, and African folk tales are spontaneous and are magical and kind of take up a life of their own. And I needed to submit to that process 100%.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. What a beautiful way to wrap this up, too. And by the way, if you're going to be teaching a course in African filmmaking in the near future, I'm your first student. 100%. I'm signing up.
I would love to.
So tell me about the film, Blitz. Array is distributing it, and by the way, folks, you can learn more about the film Array now. That's ARRAYNOW.com. Going to be released on Netflix in a couple of weeks, by the end of March 2019. Where else can people see it?
Yes, so the film's available, and we're very, very thankful to have Ava DuVernay, phenomenal filmmaker, made A Wrinkle in Time, made Selma, to be our distributor through Array.
So amazing, man.
Very fortunate to have such a voice champion this film. It's going to be on Netflix March 31st. It's also going to be on video on demand through Vimeo for territories that are in Africa, territories that are in South America, and territories that are in Central America and the EU. So we're super excited to have the film reaching an audience that we believe deserves to see it.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. Thanks so much for your time today. We've been talking with Blitz the Ambassador today about his beautiful and engaging, thoughtful new film, The Burial of Kojo. Thanks for your time, Blitz.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.